This is what happens when you try to cheat. The Democrats were seeing it with the lack of debates, which allowed the Republicans to have a ton of debates and getting their issues and views out in front of the people. But the Republicans got their asses kicked in 2012, so they decided that they were going to shrink their process. They'll have a lot of debates, but they were going to shrink it and compress it and front load the beginning of their primaries with a lot of available delegates. And the result is Donald Trump. I'm going to play this segment from the Rachel Maddow show, and she's basically going to run this down for everybody.
That were sanctioned by the party. The other thing they changed was the nominating process itself. The party believed that Mitt Romney was basically the inevitable nominee from the start of the process in 2012. But he had to slog on for too many months in that campaign with these other basically hopeless candidates dragging him down and throwing punches at him, even though they had no real chance to win themselves. Because that's the way the Republicans viewed what happened in 2012. They decided what they would do for 2016 was shorten the primary campaign. They shortened it on both ends. At the end of the process, they moved the Republican nominating convention up. So instead of happening like Labor Day, now it happens way earlier in the summer. The choice of the nominee technically will happen earlier in the process. They also changed the front end of the process. They changed the allocation of the delegates in the early states so that basically the early frontrunner in the Republican race can lock up the Republican nomination without giving any of those second-tier or straggling candidates a chance to ever catch up. And I'm sure the Republican Party feels like that would be an excellent change to apply retroactively to the 2012 primary process that chose Mitt Romney. I mean, looking back at the Romney candidacy, they're probably right. The process that they put in place after Romney lost is a process that would have helped Mitt Romney in 2012. But you can't go back to 2012. You can't go back in time. You can't fight the last war. You can only fight the next war. And this process they created to help the early frontrunner lock down the nomination and not give anybody else a chance, that is now what they are stuck with. In a year when the early frontrunner is not somebody like Mitt Romney, it's freaking Donald Trump, the guy who was too ridiculous and circus-like to even be allowed to moderate a conservative website debate the last time around, but now is running the table and locking up the nomination for himself. With Mr. Trump having won 3 of the first 4 states, with him leading in 10 of the 11 states that are going to vote on the Republican side tomorrow, that Republican Party decision to change the process so that the nominee gets picked early, so the frontrunner basically gets to lock in an early lead and convert that into the nomination, that is the whirlwind that Republicans are reaping right now as they freak out about the prospect of Donald Trump becoming their nominee. But here's the other thing that's going on that explains a little more about not just who's winning the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, but the tenor of the race as he steams toward getting that big prize. Because at the same time the Republican Party made this change to get the nominating process over and done with more quickly, as they made this change to increase the influence of the early states, they also simultaneously made a separate decision that the early states from here on out should be way more Southern than they used to be. Just look at Super Tuesday. These were the Super Tuesday states last time around, when Mitt Romney was having his hard time wrapping up the Republican nomination. This is who was voting on Super Tuesday in 2012. This is not the same group of states that's going to be voting on Super Tuesday this year. The party this year decided on a substantially different mix of states. They dropped Idaho and North Dakota and Ohio, and instead they added in states like Alabama and Arkansas and Texas. And when you add Alabama and Arkansas and Texas to the other sprinkling of southern states that already were on Super Tuesday, and you combine that newly, deeply southern Super Tuesday with a delegate allocation process that makes it basically impossible to stop a Republican frontrunner anytime after Super Tuesday, then yeah, what you end up with is a presidential nomination in the Republican Party that gets decided basically according to who can appeal to the hard right, all white, deep South conservatives of the Republican Party. In the Republican Party's new primary process, which they built because they thought it took Mitt Romney too long to lock up the nomination in 2012, in their new process where it's almost impossible to catch the frontrunner after Super Tuesday, these are this year's Super Tuesday states for the Republican Party. And no, it's not all in the South, but it is primarily in the South. Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia. And we don't have exit poll data for recent Republican primaries in a few of those states, but where we do have that exit poll data about who turns out for a Republican primary, look at the racial breakdown of the vote in those states on the Republican side. Look, Alabama's Republican primary, 94% white. Georgia's 94% white. Oklahoma, 96% white. Tennessee, 97% white. Look at Virginia. Virginia is a state that's only 71% white in terms of its population, but at the Republican primary, it's 94% white. And so, you know, what you start ends up finishing, right? Process matters. Choosing to have your nominee selected by all white, deeply conservative, hardcore Republican voters across the American South, that has consequences for who gets picked. That has consequences for what a, you know, winning campaign sounds like this year in the pursuit for the Republican presidential nomination. This was Donald Trump in Madison, Alabama this weekend in front of a crowd that local law enforcement described as 15,000 people. The Trump campaign described it as more than 30,000 people, naturally. At this huge Alabama event, no matter who's counting, Donald Trump was endorsed by the first U.S. senator who has signed on to his campaign, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions is known as the most virulent immigration opponent in the U.S. Senate. That's in part why this endorsement was seen as competitively important in the Republican race, because Ted Cruz has been dropping Jeff Sessions' name throughout his campaign in order to make himself seen as hardline anti-immigrant as possible. And the Ted Cruz campaign is already in trouble, right? They already have to be worried that they may not really be able to compete anywhere outside of Ted Cruz's home state of Texas tomorrow on Super Tuesday. With that in their plate already, Jeff Sessions endorsing Donald Trump in Alabama, that is a particular blow for Senator Ted Cruz.
Yeah, that's because Ted Cruz has been harping about Jeff Sessions this and Jeff Sessions that, because Jeff Sessions is definitely an anti-immigration guy, as is Ted Cruz. But there's a little bit more information you need to know about Jeff Sessions, and then you can figure out why he endorsed Donald Trump and what the tie-in is between Jeff Sessions, Donald Trump, and David Duke and the KKK.
So in immediate competitive terms, that's what the Jeff Sessions endorsement of Donald Trump in Alabama means. The Jeff Sessions endorsement of Donald Trump in Alabama, though, is also a good reminder of who Jeff Sessions is. Before Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III was ever elected to the United States Senate, he was rejected by the United States Senate as a nominee for a federal judgeship in the 1980s.
A federal judgeship is a lifetime appointment, and President Reagan has been nominating young men for these jobs, 32 to 38 years old. People who could keep the Reagan influence around for a long time. However, one of Mr. Reagan's nominees is in trouble in Washington, in trouble for saying that the NAACP is a pinko organization, and that a white civil rights attorney from his home state of Alabama is a disgrace to his race. NBC News national political correspondent Ken Bodie is in a Washington studio this morning with more on that nomination. Morning, Ken.
Morning, Jane. The man who said those things and who would be a federal judge is Jeff Sessions.
Mr. Sessions is a throwback to a shameful era, which I know both black and white Americans thought was in our past. It's inconceivable to me that a person of this attitude is qualified to be a U.S. attorney, let alone a United States federal judge.
Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. He was brought face to face with things he personally had said. For example, that the NAACP and the Civil Liberties Union are un-American organizations.
These comments that you could say about commie organization or something, I may have said something like that in a general way that probably was wrong.
Commie organizations. Jeff Sessions first rose to national prominence as a man with a record that was too racist for him to be confirmed as a federal judge in the Reagan era. At his confirmation hearing, a black assistant U.S. attorney in Alabama testified that Jeff Sessions had called him boy and warned him about the way he spoke to white people. That did not ultimately stop Alabama Republicans from electing Jeff Sessions to the United States Senate. Now he's the first endorsement from the United States Senate for Donald Trump for president. Donald Trump also picked up an endorsement today from the man who authored the Papers, Please anti-immigrant law in Arizona a few years ago. His name's Chris Kobach. He's the Secretary of State in Kansas. He and the man with whom he co-wrote that Papers, Please law explained to the Washington Post a couple of years ago why they wrote that bill in Arizona and why they hoped other states would adopt the Arizona language as a model. They described their motivation as such, quote, immigration is on track to change the demographic makeup of the entire country. You know, what they call minority majority. How many countries have gone through a transition like that peacefully, carefully? It's theoretically possible, but we don't have any examples. And so therefore we need anti-immigrant legislation so America doesn't go through this dangerous process of becoming minority majority. And that's the stated justification for the Papers, Please law, for this anti-immigrant law. Right? We need good anti-immigrant legislation all over the country to make sure America stays white enough. We need to keep the number of non-white people in America as low as possible so we don't become minority majority. So Donald Trump just got the Chris Kobach endorsement too. He also recently picked up a gubernatorial endorsement from this guy.
Now the traffickers, these are people that take drugs. These are guys that are named D-Money, Smoothie, Shifty, these type of guys that come from Connecticut, New York. They come up here, they sell their heroin, then they go back home. Incidentally, half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave. I was going impromptu and my brain didn't catch up to my mouth. Instead of saying Maine women, I said white women. If you go, and I'm not going to apologize to the Maine women for that, because if you go to Maine, you will see that we're at essentially 95% white. If you want to make it racist, go right ahead, do whatever you want.
It was Maine Governor Paul LePage in the brief interregnum when he was still insisting that he didn't mean to say anything about race at all. That was before a few days later he finally just said this.
I had to go screaming and talk top of my lungs about black dealers coming in and doing the things that they're doing to our state.
So Donald Trump just got Paul LePage's endorsement as well. I mean, this is a race where even in Iowa and New Hampshire, there were white supremacist robocalls, literally from groups that identified themselves overtly as white nationalist groups, sending out robocalls to Iowa and New Hampshire Republican voters, telling them to vote for Donald Trump basically as a matter of white pride. That was already happening in Iowa and New Hampshire before the Republican presidential contests took their turn to the Deep South. But now the Republican presidential contests have taken their turn to the Deep South.
Here's what's going to happen 100%. They're going to call me back, and they're going to say, Mr. President, let's get him out. Get him out. Are you from Mexico? Are you from Mexico? Huh? Are you from Mexico? There's a hostility toward me by the judge, tremendous hostility, beyond belief. I believe he happens to be Spanish, which is fine. He's Hispanic, which is fine. And we haven't asked for a recusal, which we may do, but we have a judge who's very hostile. We have a very hostile judge. Now, he is Hispanic, I believe, and he is a very hostile judge to me, and I've said it loud and clear.
I want to ask you about the Anti-Defamation League, which this week called on you to publicly condemn, unequivocally, the racism of former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, who recently said that voting against you at this point would be treason to your heritage. Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists. So
that's weird. He doesn't know David Duke, and he doesn't know anything about white supremacy. It's a fucking joke. This guy, if he's not a racist, he damn sure is catering to him. But you know, it's so bad that it's so tragic that it even makes me laugh.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, did he endorse me or what's going on? Because, you know, I know nothing about David Duke. I know nothing about white supremacists. And so you're asking me a question that I'm supposed to be talking about people that I know nothing about.
But I guess the question from the Anti-Defamation League is, even if you don't know about their endorsement, there are these groups and individuals endorsing you. Would you just say unequivocally you condemn them and you don't want their support?
Well, I have to look at the group. I mean, I don't know what group you're talking about. You wouldn't want me to condemn a group that I know nothing about. I'd have to look. If you would send me a list of the groups, I will do research on them, and certainly I would disavow if I thought there was something wrong. But you may have groups in there that are totally fine, and it would be very unfair. So give me a list of the groups, and I'll let you know.
Okay. I mean, I'm just talking about David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan here, but...
I don't know, honestly, I don't know David Duke. I don't believe I've ever met him. I'm pretty sure I didn't meet him, and I just don't know anything about him.
All right.
Republican frontrunner Donald Trump on CNN yesterday refusing to condemn David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan, which is a little weird because Mr. Trump had previously said he would disavow David Duke's support. Now he claims that whole CNN exchange happened because his earpiece did not work properly and he could not hear the question and he did not understand what he was commenting on, even though he himself a number of times said the name David Duke during that interview. So if you believe that it was all an earpiece problem, there's some very nice swamp front property you might want to invest in while you're scouting locations for your March 15th Florida primary hootenanny. When George Wallace ran for president on an explicitly segregationist political platform in 1968, one of the things we've been able to find in the old news footage of his rallies that I always think is interesting is people holding up signs with swastikas on them and things that say things like Sieg Heil and Hitler II. Those were not neo-Nazis at George Wallace rallies. Those were protesters showing up at George Wallace rallies, trying to sound the alarm to the country about what kind of racist demagogue George Wallace was and the racist demagoguery that he represented with his campaign. And that kind of denunciation of George Wallace, it worked in 1968. It worked in most places, but it did not work everywhere. George Wallace, on his explicitly segregationist platform in 1968, he won 5 states in the general election. And 3 of those 5 states, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas, are going to be voting tomorrow. And all of them are strongly favored to go to Donald Trump tomorrow. And because of the front-loaded importance and influence of states like that in the Republican process this year, the big wins he's expected to get in those George Wallace states tomorrow will go a long way toward propelling him to the Republican presidential nomination and toward putting that nomination out of reach of anyone else in the field. If you design a system like this, it will produce an outcome like this.
So, as I stated in previous videos, Donald Trump is more than likely going to win the nomination of the Republican Party. So they will be putting an avowed racist sympathizer. I won't call him a racist, I'll call him a sympathizer because he's enjoying the support of racists and he's not actually condemning them in any way other than flippantly. So it's going to be interesting.